The 1965 legislation that created the NEH defined the agency's jurisdiction as including the study and review of history, literature, philosophy, comparative religion, jurisprudence, and related disciplines. Our mandate is both to spur knowledge development, i.e. research in these fields, and also to disseminate knowledge, i.e. reach out to the public in as many educative ways as possible, from public programming of various kinds to documentaries. As chairman of the NEH, I'd like to thank you for coming to the second celebration at the White House of the Constitution and the power of bridging cultures through law. The first in the Constitution series was the Emmy Award-winning documentary Freedom Riders, which is a story of how it took almost a century for 19th century constitutional amendments to be enforced in public transit. It is a story of courage, how a small group, barely 400, largely young, conscience-driven citizens were beaten and imprisoned for the crime of standing up for human dignity and constitutional values. Today's subject matter, prohibition, is unique in our constitutional history because it is about how and why the public insisted that an amendment to the Constitution be made and then unmade. It is also the story of America and competitive American attitudes towards freedom and order. Before getting to a discussion of the themes of the film, I'd like to express my appreciation to the American Constitution Society and the faculty and deans from the law schools represented here. A special thanks goes to Chris Bracey from the George Washington University Law School for advising us and making the reception following this event at GW Law possible. Florentine Films, with the special help of Sarah Botstein, as well as Lynn Novick, enthusiastically cut the special reel you just watched. And as Kathy Rumler noted in her introduction, we are honored to have here much of the top brass from WIDA and the world of public television, which has partnered with NEH and others in funding this extraordinary documentary. Now I want to tell you a little about the thoughtful panel we've assembled to discuss the film. First, you've already met the co-producer director of Prohibition, Lynn Novick. Partnering with Ken Burns, Lynn has been producing exceptional Emmy Award-winning documentary films about American history for more than 20 years, with subjects ranging from baseball to the war to jazz and to the life of Frank Lloyd Wright. Also joining us is Daniel Okrent, author of the book the film is based upon, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition. Dan has had a distinguished career in the worlds of journalism, publishing, film, and nonfiction writing. Professor David Fontana joins us from the George Washington University Law School. Professor Fontana specializes in constitutional law and comparative constitutional law. He has contributed to a number of prominent law reviews and academic publications and has advised a number of governments on the process of constitution drafting. We also would like to welcome the Honorable Andre M. Davis. Judge Davis was appointed by President Obama to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Prior to his appointment to a bench one step removed from the Supreme Court, Judge Davis served in the District Court of Maryland for Baltimore City, the Circuit Court for Baltimore City, the U.S. District Court, and has been a member of the faculty of the National Judicial College. Moderating today's discussion will be Carolyn Fredrickson, the president of the American Constitution Society. Carolyn has had a lengthy legal and public service career, having served as the director of ACLU's Washington Legislative Office, as chief of staff to Senator Maria Cantwell, as deputy chief of staff to then Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, and a special assistant to the president for legislative affairs in the Clinton administration. I will now hand things over to Carolyn to lead the discussion. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Chairman Leach. And I'd very much like to thank the NEH and the White House for having this wonderful, wonderful event. I'm sure everybody in the audience, if you haven't seen the movie before, you're obviously going to rush out and buy the whole set so you can see the rest of it. It is an incredibly wonderful movie, and I've enjoyed it every time I've seen it, and I learn more and more. I have a special reason to find this interesting. I actually grew up in Evanston, Illinois, which is the home of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is just north of Chicago, so it's kind of interesting. I kept looking at that map where the legislation was being adopted to ban alcohol, and I kept looking for Illinois, and somehow I guess they weren't very effective in their own backyard. But so this is just a tremendous, tremendous moment in American history. And the movie captures it so well. So I'd like to, we're going to go through a fairly short discussion up here, and then I want to open it up as quickly as possible to questions from the audience, because there's so much to talk about in this movie. It's even hard to start. But I want to ask Lynn a very, very general question. You know, after all the incredible movies that you've made on such interesting topics, how did you come to Prohibition? What was it that captured you about this story?
Well, you know, I think, first of all, I would just like to acknowledge that the reason we made the film really is because Dan Okrent was working on his book and suggested it as a topic to us. So without having had Dan's suggestion, we never would have really probably thought that it was a subject we should explore. And, you know, we've talked about the 20s and many other projects, but never looked at prohibition as a subject in and of itself. And once we heard a little bit from Dan about why he was drawn to the subject and we started to do our own research, we realized how incredibly relevant it was and how much it had so many echoes of today. I mean, you see sort of single-issue lobbying, demonization of immigrants, unfunded mandates, overreaching federal agents breaking the law, so many different ways in which red state versus blue state and kind of religious divides being exploited by different interest groups. It resonated on so many levels for us. We sort of came to see it as really the archetypal culture war. And it seemed to be a cautionary tale from which so much seemed to flow, that the more we delved into it, the more we were fascinated to find those resonances and also to kind of understand the question that Dan asked at the beginning of the film. How the hell did that happen? Why did we do this? It wasn't for no reason. I mean, I think we tried to really look seriously and sympathetically at the people who wanted this. Many of them wanted it for good reasons, that alcoholism is a terrible, terrible problem, and it ravaged communities, and it was a serious, serious thing that society had to deal with. And of course, what the example of prohibition is, that sometimes the approach is not the one that was taken, to use government to interdict something that is embedded in society and culture to deal with a problem that affects 10% of the population, or however you want to slice it. So it just raised a lot of really interesting and important questions that we feel are just as resonant today as they were back then.
Thank you. And Daniel, I'm going to ask you sort of a similar question, but you know what really is fascinating about this particular period and the amendment was how quickly it passed and how quickly it failed. And you know, if you look at the arc of most, you know, how long it takes to pass an amendment, the incredible odds that are stacked against, you know, 2/3 of Congress, quarters of the legislatures, you know, how did this happen and why did it come undone so quickly?
Well, how it happened, there were three extrinsic factors, a couple of which we saw in the excerpt there. One was, really the final one, was the anti-German feeling. That World War I was used for it, to make it, to get it through. The income tax amendment with the 16th Amendment was absolutely essential for the reasons explained. And then the other was the women's suffrage movement, that the women of the WCTU were also the core of the group that were pushing for the 19th Amendment, which entered the Constitution at nearly the same time. They were really siblings. They were tied together. It's something that I think a lot of people forget. Susan B. Anthony began her career as a temperance worker, and when she was not allowed to speak at a convention of the Sons of Temperance, that's what drove her into the suffrage movement. So things that had nothing to do with liquor were the things that made it possible. So when can we get this sort of a circumstance again? It's not likely that it happens, that it would happen. Why did it fail so quickly? Well, it didn't have popular support. The legislatures and the Congress were ahead of the people, which is always a dangerous place to be. There was no popular support. It wasn't remotely supported by a majority of people. It was a very well-engineered campaign, working on the margins, working much as the NRA does today. Care about one issue, you're more likely to have your way with that issue.
I guess the NRA already has their amendment, so they don't need to.
Well, they think they have their amendment. Let's ask Judge Davis whether he does.
Well, that's a very good point. And on that, so David, you're a constitutional scholar. How do you see the passage of the Prohibition Amendment sort of being different from the consideration and passage of other amendments to the Constitution? It is so anomalous in that sense. Well, certainly the only one that's been repealed, but also just. It was, as Daniel says, if the Congress and the state legislatures were so far ahead of the people, how did that happen? And do you see other lessons for us about the Constitution?
Yeah, it's a very unique kind of moment in American constitutional history in at least a few ways. First of all, it applies to private conduct. Most of our Constitution is about what the government can or cannot do. We have the 13th Amendment from the Civil War, which says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist. But Prohibition is talking about what regular citizens, people like you or I, can or cannot do. And in a lot of ways, Prohibition sets the stage for arguments that we see later in the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, ways in which rights and concerns might implicate what private citizens are doing and not just the government. One other way in which I think it actually has an influence even beyond the immediate period when it's in the Constitution is that it sets the stage for the creation of a major federal government in Washington. Americans at the time are not used to the idea of the federal government being a substantial part of where policy comes from. If we went outside of this building, we could see many miles. There wouldn't be much of a federal government. Cleveland Park was a weekend vacation place where people in Washington went. But Prohibition not only got Americans used to the idea that there might be a substantial federal regulatory apparatus, but started to introduce a lot of ideas and arguments about how that might be consistent with our constitutional system. So Felix Frankfurter, later on the Supreme Court, wrote several essays about how we might have prohibition and also a constitutional system. And then, as the film alluded to, there are a large number of cases about the Fourth Amendment, about search and seizure, and how that can be compatible with a major federal government. Between 1920 and 1933, there are 20 Fourth Amendment cases, 3/4 of which are about prohibition. And the sorts of arguments we saw during that time are the arguments that came about later as the federal government during the New Deal and later started to do more and more. So for me, what's significant about it is how it kind of presaged a lot of things that you saw later in the century in constitutional law.
Well, Judge Davis, I think one of the issues that must come to mind for you watching this is as you sit on the Fourth Circuit and you hear cases involving all sorts of criminal and civil matters, the widespread disobedience, the willful looking up the other way by law enforcement of all of the violations. Is there any other? Can you think of how does that impact the law generally? I mean, what are the sort of the other consequences that flow from that for our sort of sense of rule of law and the system of justice that we have?
Well, it's absolutely remarkable. As we heard in the excerpts, judges were not above the muck that was generated by Prohibition. But there's so many lessons here in this special moment in American history that are particularly resonant with law students and people involved in the legal profession. It was particularly remarkable for me to see Justice Stevens up here, retired Justice Stevens, because some of you may not know, part of Justice Stevens' judicial philosophy arises out of charges placed against his dad when he was a young man. He was found not guilty, but it really gave Justice Stevens a special appreciation for our criminal justice system. But what we see, among other things, I'll mention two, are the echoes of the war on drugs that we just completed the 40th year on what one has to say is the unsuccessful war on drugs. And one of the reasons for the lack of success has to do with the focus on the supply side rather than the demand side of what many might perceive to be less than desirable social habits. And so hopefully we can draw some lessons from the Prohibition era and bring them forward today and perhaps be smarter and more efficient in addressing our substance abuse problem today. The other thing that really strikes me, again, going back to the law students who are present, law is inherently a multidisciplinary undertaking. We hear in law schools and in the legal profession generally, we give multidisciplinary types of courses and so forth, but it's inherently multidisciplinary, and you cannot be a good, effective advocate without a deep appreciation for the cultural, social context in which laws are adopted. Let me say one more thing. You know, for judges particularly, when either the Congress gets out ahead of the people or when judges get out ahead of the people, bad things happen. Really bad things happen to good people. And this is a real cautionary tale, a real object lesson for us to be wary of attempting to turn our grand document of the Constitution into some kind of code of behavior, because I think it's doomed to failure.
Well, those are very interesting points, and I think there was so much that was surprising about the movie in terms of the sort of the analogies to contemporary situations. And I think, Daniel, you had a comment in the film of how it was prohibition for others, temperance for other people and prohibition for other people. As my mother's French, so it's the section of describing what was done, how Germans were treated, and the Liberty Cabbage, and brought, memories of, a certain freedom fries that the House Republicans passed legislation or rules changing the name of the French fries in the House cafeteria. What else, for both you and Lynn, as you sort of delved into the subject, what were the things that you found most sort of surprising, the most sort of similar to what you see as contemporary issues?
The one that most surprised me, and that we didn't see in this excerpt here, is how Prohibition ended and what caused it to end. It was a failure within 2 or 3 years. It wasn't working, but nobody had ever repealed an amendment before. And as late as 1930, Clarence Darrow, who was, as you can imagine, a very wet, said there's no chance, let's change the Volstead Act, let's change the definition of what's an intoxicating beverage. What ended it was the stock market crash, and the fact that the federal government was no longer collecting tax revenue. Income tax collections went down 30% in the 4 years after the crash, as the Depression deepened. There were no capital gains taxes of any kind at all, and somebody said, where can we get the money to run the government? Well, the excise tax on liquor, which once accounted for 40% of domestic revenue for the federal government. We're in the same place today, and the measure that didn't pass in California a few years ago was entitled a measure to tax and regulate marijuana, and that word tax is key to it. As we see people not wanting to pay taxes and we turn more to user taxes, I think we are going to see these laws collapse, not because of a moral view or a social view, because of the need of the government to fund its operations.
What about you, Lynn?
Well, it's perhaps embarrassing to say, but everything surprised me because I knew so little about the subject, which is one of the fun parts of our job, is to learn something new. But if I really had to isolate it, I think for me it was the sense of how widespread the law breaking was. I mean, I think going into this, we kind of knew about Al Capone and the gangsters who were clearly taking advantage of Prohibition, but I did not actually understand until we started working on the film and talking to people who were old enough to have lived through it, or people who had family members who told them stories, that it was so pervasive. Everybody's uncle had a still in the basement, or their grandmother made wine and sold it to the neighbors, or, just a little something on the side. It was just this sort of widespread disregard for the law, and that really got us thinking about what does that mean for the fabric of society, where you have not just any old law, but something that's enshrined in the Constitution that's being so widely disregarded. And yes, all the bribery and corruption that happened, but just the sort of day-to-dayness of it, that you could just, no, people just didn't take the law seriously. There's just a lack of respect, and what that really meant. If you're a parent and you tell your child not to do something because it's against the law, but everybody else is doing it, how does that play out? And that was a really interesting thing to explore, and it was instantaneous from the minute Prohibition went into effect. and just continued. I think that sense of hypocrisy, which was to me embodied by Donald Ward, the man who was talking about his father delivering the suitcase to the United States Capitol. You just couldn't get any more insane than that. So that was a wonderful find for us as filmmakers, but also quite a surprise. And I just will also say that one of the things that was most rewarding about the project for me and working with Sarah Botstein, our producer, was all the home movies she was able to find where you saw people in the privacy of their own homes making fun of Prohibition, kidding around, pretending to be drunk, staggering, and then also just drinking. And so you sort of get the sense, is Prohibition actually happening? You couldn't even tell from these home movies that it was against the law to do, well, it wasn't against the law to drink, but it was against the law for people to sell it to you. So someone broke the law for these people to be having parties, toasting with champagne, and you'd never know it. So it was just astonishing, really.
Well, I have to say those movie clips were so fabulous, and I kept wondering how you possibly found all of that great material, because it was really, really wonderful to watch and so insightful. So let me ask David and Judge Davis, one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But there is this, sort of, obviously the Constitution is the major story here about a change to the Constitution and a change of the nature that David had mentioned, which was unique in regulating private behavior in this context and imposing a sort of a moral code through the Constitution. What do you think, this story tells us about our Constitution in the sense of, it is kind of hard to change it. It's hard to amend it. It's hard to repeal amendments. In this case, it was pretty easy to do both. But generally, what does that arc of that story tell us about our own Constitution?
Well, one of the lessons that I come away with is just the audacity of the effort and the profound success in getting it approved. And so that can be a lesson to people at the grassroots and involved in politics, which I'm not as a judge, but it does tell us that things can get accomplished when people care deeply enough about it. But it also tells us that the excerpt dealing with Justice Brandeis's famous dissent in the Olmstead case, for those of you who've had con law, you probably know, if you made a list of the 3 most famous dissents in American Supreme Court jurisprudence, after Plessy versus Ferguson, Justice Harlan's great dissent, surely Justice Brandeis's dissent in Olmsted's number 2 or number 3. I don't know what would be number 3. But the part that we didn't hear, which is equally important, is a short excerpt in which Justice Brandeis talks about the government as lawbreaker and how the government is a model for its citizens. And I can't help but think that he was thinking about Prohibition and what he was seeing as an observer of the American scene and what had been done to his Constitution and our Constitution, and it resonates even today in a very profound way. Dave.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about Prohibition is that it also marks the end of an era of how we achieved constitutional change. If you think of what comes before Prohibition, the major changes in American policy, a lot of them do happen by constitutional amendment. We get the income tax by constitutional amendment. After the Civil War, we passed 3 constitutional amendments. Women's suffrage, constitutional amendment. Prohibition is really the last major policy change achieved by constitutional amendment. The New Deal, we have statutes. The Constitution is untouched. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, healthcare, right? It's all done by statutes. So partly, I think, in response to what happened during Prohibition, people looked for other ways to change our fundamental law. And after Prohibition, we start to see major statutes, kind of small c constitutional change rather than big C constitutional change.
Daniel.
I think that's absolutely right. And on top of it, I think it's at the same time impossible to do today. If we can imagine our current political climate, imagine 2/3 of each House of Congress agreeing on whether Monday should come after Sunday, and then adding, in this case, 38 state legislatures on top of that. I think we are done with the era of the constitutional amendment. The amendments since women's suffrage, they moved the date of inauguration day. They did lower the voting age to 18. That was substantial. But other than that, it's small-time stuff now.
Although, wouldn't you say, before we turn over to the audience, that there have been other efforts that, while not successful, have actually had profound impact on the American
In fact,
political scene.
the great, and Prohibition has its very large role in the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment, which just misses by this much because there was a time limit, and there had never been a time limit before the compromise that was made on Prohibition. So it's always with us.
Well, with that, I'm sure that we have many of you who have questions, and we'd like to give you some time to ask this great panel. Catherine.
I'd never heard before about, I guess, the immigration issues that were surrounding Prohibition. I found that really interesting, especially the issues around German immigrants. Were other immigrant groups also targeted, or was it mostly German?
It really does come, the impetus for Prohibition and a lot of the concerns about it really stemmed from a sense of a lot of immigrants were coming to America in the 19th century, not just Germans. A lot of Germans had already been here. Irish, Italian, Jewish, Eastern European, Southern European, who had very different drinking habits than the native-born Anglo-Saxon Protestants in small towns in the Midwest, let's just say. So you had a huge conflict between urban and rural small-town America. And to small-town America, the urban world was symbolized by immigrants who weren't real Americans. So it really wasn't just German. That was the culmination during World War I. But there was tremendous fear of social change, tremendous fear of these immigrants who weren't considered up to snuff in so many ways. And the alcohol issue was kind of overlaid onto it, and they kind of went along together. But it's hard to separate them.
It's also really remarkable to see the way that people we think of as heroes of our past used anti-immigrant feeling, particularly some of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement who are also involved in the temperance and prohibition movement. Frances Willard, obviously, prohibition specifically, but also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the speeches they gave, which were filled with horrible, terrible rhetoric against the scum of Europe coming to our shores, and they shouldn't be allowed to make our laws. One of the leading organizations backing Prohibition was the KKK, as an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, was a tool to get the immigrant.
And I suppose you could say the same about all the racism that was involved. I mean, the movie shows some of
enormously.
that.
Absolutely.
I was just curious as to whether the wine exception was sort of tailored to avoid potential religious freedom issues, or...
The Volstead Act was filled with loopholes. Actually, there were many loopholes, like lots of legislation. So it was this very noble amendment, which was very pure. Only 0.5% alcohol, anything was supposed to be not allowed. But then there was an exemption for making your own wine, and there was also a religious exemption for wine.
The religious exemption is great. There was a man in California named Georges Delatour who owned Beaulieu Vineyard, still an important vineyard in California, and he had what was called an ecclesiastic approbation to make communion wine. And he made a lot of communion wine through Prohibition. He had been making it before. He genuinely was selling communion wine all over the country. In 1921, after a year of Prohibition, he issued a sales brochure in which he offered communion wine in 10 different grape varietals. And you could get it in everything from Cabernet to name your grape. So it was an interesting version of religion. Oh, and then the rabbis, the Orthodox rabbis, immigrant Orthodox rabbis, made quite a good living out of selling wine to their congregations. That kind of came to an end, and there was a crackdown on how much they were allowed to sell when a couple of rabbis in New York named McGraw, McGuire, and Houlihan were arrested for selling wine as well.
And of course, remember, there was no prohibition on possession and consumption, and there was an exception for what was already in your possession at the time the amendment took effect. So if you had a 14-year supply of your best scotch, you were good. You were good to go.
The Yale Club in New York had 14 years. It lasted all the way through.
You said that the politicians were out ahead of the people. I'm just wondering what kind of political backlash there was against the champions of Prohibition, or did they see any fallout?
No. I mean, not until after the 1928 election. The 1928 election established the Democrats as the wet party because of Al Smith's position heading the ticket, and then there was some movement it was influenced by Prohibition, if not directly reactive to it.
But it was far more common for a politician to lose their seat or be threatened if they were against prohibition. For most of prohibition, it was political suicide to even to suggest that prohibition wasn't working.
There was also mention in the film of the support that Al Capone, financial support that he gave to Mayor Thompson. The way that the bootleggers did it was that they supported people in executive positions who were wet, like Thompson, but they supported the dry legislators. They gave money to there was nobody happier with prohibition than the mobsters. It was Baptists and bootleggers, as one term used it. So the political divide was extremely peculiar.
I really appreciate the parallel to the war on drugs, because as I was watching this, I was thinking about, in context of federal and state regulation of marijuana, and it was mentioned a number of times that the failure of prohibition is in some ways attributable to trying to attack the supply side. I'm wondering what the government's role, if any, would be in making movement on the demand side in terms of the war on drugs, if anybody has input to that effect.
Education?
I agree
I
with
mean,
that.
ultimately, that's, I say, right? I mean,
And treatment on demand. That's the gold standard that hopefully we're aspiring to and one day we'll actually achieve.
One thing, too, about prohibition, as the book indicates, is that alcohol consumption did go down. Now, whether there's a causal story, it's certainly a part of it, but, whatever disregard there was for prohibition as a law, it did affect the demand side.
I just wanted to comment on that. One of the things I found particularly startling about the movie was how much Americans were consuming before Prohibition. It was it was 6 gallons.
7.3 gallons. In 1830, which was the peak, or the nadir, your choice, was the average American 15 years or older drank the equivalent of 90/5 of 80 proof liquor. Every time I've mentioned that, people have gasped, except when I said it to the wine and spirits wholesalers, and they applauded.
The good old days. Yeah. So we must have some more questions out there. Yes, sir.
You talked briefly about switching from constitutional amendments as a focus to other things. Do you think that also changed the role of the Supreme Court?
Well, one of the interesting constitutional stories, not really in the book or the film, is one of the significant constitutional challenges to prohibition is a challenge that it's an unconstitutional constitutional amendment. So the idea is that the amendment part of Article 5, which is the shortest one of the constitutional articles, is just for tinkering. It's for small changes. There's a group of prominent lawyers who leads a challenge to the initial Prohibition Amendment saying it's an unconstitutional constitutional amendment, and they get some serious people behind them. Charles Evans Hughes, who's presidential candidate in 1916, later Chief Justice, backs their claim. Their articles in the Harvard Law Review, Virginia Law Review. And in a really significant case, the national prohibition cases, the Supreme Court says that the Constitution can be amended to do anything, right? As long as you abide by the terms of Article 5, basically you can do whatever you want. This ends up becoming really significant because it does basically take the court out of any constitutional amendments. Even if we did have any constitutional amendments, there'd be very little that the Supreme Court could say about it, while, as we've seen, there's much that the court can do about the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Affordable Care Act, et cetera.
Which, there was an allusion earlier to the Second Amendment. To the extent that a particular justice or group of justices believe that constitutional rights are simply codifications of pre-existing rights, then we get into some more interesting kinds of dialogues about, is it the fact that you can amend the Constitution to say anything?
There's also the aspect of the 112 words of the 18th Amendment relative to the 35 pages of the Volstead Act. What happens in the next stage, of course, you all know very well, is absolutely critical to it. And I mentioned what Darrow had done, but the reality was that you could have changed the definition of intoxicating beverages, and it would have been gone. That was in the hands of the legislature and the president.
Any more questions? In the back.
So one of the vignettes in the movie that I thought was particularly interesting was the man who was talking about the traffic lights in Cairo and how eventually once nobody is, seeing red and stopping anymore, it's not a law, and the policeman can do whatever he wants, but nothing's going to change. And I was wondering how, when you see these examples now in the context of, obviously marijuana, it's very widely used, socially acceptable in terms of the media, it's out there. And even in terms of something like taxes, where you have corporations that pay, a lot less than the rate that they're supposed to pay or that they're legislated and says to pay. How does that level of evasion or just even like blatant disregard for law, how is that part of the American experience, which I think in a lot of ways it is, but also how does that inform lawmaking in general?
That's a great observation. I'll take a first crack at that. Look, I am no economist, but I do read the papers, and what I hear about what goes on in places like Greece and Italy with regard to tax evasion and that kind of thing is exactly what you're talking about. And it's the kind of thing that I can tell you judges, federal judges as well as state judges in this country, worry about all the time. Not much keeps me awake at night, but if there's anything, it's the idea that we will have an infrastructure of prohibitions and mandates that are so lacking in popular legitimacy that the Cairo traffic signal example, which my wife and I have actually seen and made our way across streets in Cairo, so that observation was absolutely correct. So we worry about that. And so what's really important is that we have a balance. There's a moral ingredient in many laws, but that moral ingredient can't be too big. It's like putting too much sugar in a great recipe. And we worry about making sure that the balance is kept true and that we not get out ahead of people, but that we, as Brandeis said, we have the government as a role model for people, that we habitually obey the law. That's what we want to teach our children, that you habitually obey the law, and one of the reasons you do that is because the law is a good thing. And people obey the law and obey Supreme Court judgments, not because the Supreme Court has an army, not because the Supreme Court is able to raise money, but because of popular acceptance of the legitimacy of the rule of law.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have earlier in the film, Noah Feldman, who was telling the traffic story, also just said, I actually remember when we started working on the film, kind of asking myself, why do we obey the law? What actually propels us as citizens? We don't agree with every single law, most of us, but most of us, right, I think, most Americans do mostly obey most laws, you could say. And he sort of said, look, there's two reasons. One is if it reflects your moral code of the society and your family and the traditions you have been brought up with, or you're afraid of getting caught. So then you have the whole enforcement piece, which in Prohibition was a joke. I mean, ultimately, the Congress did not want to spend the money to pay for enforcement, so they had appropriated enough money for 1,200 agents for the entire country to enforce a law that was widely going to be disregarded. So there was not really impetus to enforce it effectively, but what would that have taken? A police state of the magnitude that you cannot even imagine, to go into every single person's house and see if they have grapes and, I mean, it would be impossible to enforce it. So to have the balance between the moral foundation and the possibility of enforcing those few who would break it or setting examples by them, that's the magic sort of special sauce you need, and that's certainly what we didn't have during Prohibition.
A lot of the dry politicians were very cynical about it. And in one of the very common phrases of the day, it really worked out perfectly for everybody. The dries had their law and the wets had their liquor. That's all they needed.
I think maybe one thing I would add to Noah Feldman's pillars of the rule of law is democracy. And I think that is one point that Judge Davis made that is extremely important, is the fact that here we had a situation where there was an amendment adopted, but it didn't reflect really a popular movement or a support of the people. Whereas, I think we don't all agree with all of the laws that Congress passes, that's for sure. But, on the other hand, we accept them even when we disagree with them, mostly because we have a democratic process and we understand that's how our government works. That's sort of the community, you know, the sort of the world we come from. But I want to give you the last question.
So the question I have has to do with criminal defense lawyers. Now, you know, we've talked about the judges and we've talked about prosecutors, and we saw all of the crime that was taking place and the bribery and so on and so forth. I was wondering if part of the story that we didn't see was the story of the rise of the specialized criminal defense lawyer, maybe a sort of criminal defense bar of prohibition to deal not just with the modest enforcement measures that were taking place, but also all of the other potential law violations that were taking place and having to defend against those, like bribery, and all of the other legal affairs that needed to be organized. So I guess my question is, was there a wet bar also?
Oh, well, I was just going to talk about Remus. I'm sure there was. We only focus on one character in the film who was a criminal defense lawyer, but he was extremely successful criminal defense lawyer, one of the best in Chicago, and he was defending all these bootleggers, and basically the deal was if you just pled to being guilty, you'd get a fine, a very large fine, maybe $1,000, $500. You know, that's a lot of money back then. That would be a working man's wage for a year. They were pulling out $1,000 bills, which were printed in great quantity during Prohibition, paying their fine, going back to work. And he decided, aha, I'm in the wrong line of work. And he became one of the biggest bootleggers in the United States.
You will also be shocked to learn that the Assistant Attorney General who was in charge of prohibition enforcement, when she lost her job, she went to work for the people who were making the wine bricks.
So maybe, do we have time for one more question? I know there was another hand up.
So I just wanted to ask the panel what they thought of Boardwalk Empire.
Oh. Anyone see it?
I have actually not seen it.
I haven't seen it.
I have not seen all of it. I've seen parts of it. I thought it was really, really good. The parts I saw seemed quite, exaggerated for television, dramatically speaking, but it had an authentic feel to me and felt like they had done their homework.
It looks right, but I asked the guy who created it, Terrence Winter, who's a very appealing guy, but why do you call the Women's Christian Temperance Union the Women's Christian Temperance League, as it was called? And he said, I don't know.
But they have done their homework, and there are a lot of characters in there that are, real life characters. In fact, the criminal defense lawyer I was just talking about, he's a character in the film, and he was definitely a real person. I mean, they did their homework, and they really wanted to kind of give a sense of the feelings of the times and the hypocrisies. I thought it's HBO. I mean, it's a drama. It's not a documentary, but we thought it was pretty darn good.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us in this wonderful discussion, and thank the panel so much for being so terrific and interesting. We want to make sure that all of you know that there's a reception to follow that is hosted by the National Endowment for the Humanities and George Washington Law School. And you will be given directions to the reception when you leave. We very much hope that you will join us there, and let's give a big thanks to this